Hey everyone, a very warm welcome to the Fisdom Wealthcast. Today, once again, it's going to be a super exciting episode. As always, I'm super charged up, but today I have all the more reason to be the same. With us, we have a very special guest. With us, we have Mr. Navneet Munot, who is the CEO of HDFC Asset Management Company, which is amongst India's largest asset management companies. It manages upwards of 4 lakh crores of rupees, and I'm just super stoked to have this conversation with Navneet. Navneet, so a very warm welcome to the Fisdom Wealthcast.
Entirely my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nirav.
So, Navneet, without any further ado, right, our audience is generally very impatient, and I have to start off with my quintessential question, and let me do the build up for that. So आजकल हम देखते हैं कि मीडिया खास करके जो काफी हेडलाइंस है जो मीडिया पर चल रहे हैं और साथ ही साथ सोशल मीडिया इंक्लूसिव काफी एंड ऑफ द स्पेक्ट्रम टाइप एक्सट्रीम टाइप स्टेटमेंट्स हमें सुनाई पड़ता है लाइक एट वन एंड वी आर हियरिंग अबाउट द रिस्क्स ऑफ अ ट्विन डेफिसिट और बहुत ज्यादा प्रॉब्लम चल रहा है इकोनॉमी में ट्विन डेफिसिट का जो रिस्क है वो बढ़ते ही जा रहा है बट साथ ही साथ हम देख रहे हैं कि केपेक्स रिकवरी जो है दैट इज शोइंग ग्रीन शूट्स काफी अच्छा समय भी आने वाला है एक तरफ हम सुन रहे हैं कि रुपी डेप्रिशिएट करे जा रहा है आरबीआई भी कुछ कंट्रोल नहीं कर पा रहा उस पर और दूसरी तरफ हम सुन रहे हैं कि आरबीआई काफी इफेक्टिवली जो रुपी का फॉल है उसको मेंटेन कर रहा है एक तरफ हम सुन रहे हैं कि बैंक्स जो है वो क्रेडिट दे नहीं पा रहे क्रेडिट ऑफ टेक किक ऑफ नहीं हो रहा है और एक तरफ सुन रहे हैं दैट द एनपीए लेवल इज एट अ मल्टी डिकेडल लो एंड देयर इज नो टाइम बेटर for the banking industry which will be reflected so jo itne extreme type opinions hote hain and through experience we have learned that the truth lies somewhere in the middle life is not binary not 0 and 1 not black or white it is somewhere in between the 0 and 1 somewhere in between the black and white so the most quintessential question that I always ask and which the only single most important question जो हमारे सारे ऑडियंसेस को है एट दिस पॉइंट इन टाइम फ्रॉम एन इकोनॉमिक पर्सपेक्टिव आपके हिसाब से मार्केट क्या बोलता है
सो इकोनॉमी और मार्केट डे टू डे साथ में नहीं मूव होते हैं, दोनों अलग अलग मूव होते हैं। और ऑल्सो आपने बोला कि हमारी ऑडियंस बहुत इम्पेशेंट है। एक्चुअली मेरे को
या
कॉम्प्लीमेंट देना चाहिए आप लोगों को और सभी लोगों को कि म्यूचुअल फंड इंडस्ट्री में लास्ट कुछ सालों में हमने देखा है कि इन्वेस्टर्स बहुत पेशेंट हो गए हैं। अगर आप एसआईपी का फ्लोज देखेंगे लाइक करीब 12,000 करोड़ के ऊपर है। इतनी वॉलेटिलिटी पिछले कई वर्षों में हमने देखी है। उसके बाद भी इन्वेस्टर्स तो काफ़ी पेशेंस दिखा रहे हैं, जो बहुत अच्छी चीज़ है। लॉन्ग टर्म में वेल्थ क्रिएशन उसी तरह से होता है और ये सही है। जनरली कभी भी डिस्कशन होता है तो पहला क्वेश्चन आता है बाजार क्या लगता है। बट आपने पूछा ब्रॉडर में इकोनॉमी के बारे में। सो मैक्रो इकोनॉमी अगर हम देखेंगे ओवरऑल तो विश्व में जरूर इंटरेस्ट रेट्स ऊपर जा रही है। इन्फ्लेशन सब जगहों पर ऊपर है। यूएस में 8% के ऊपर इन्फ्लेशन है। इन यूरोपियन यूनियन 8% के ऊपर इन्फ्लेशन है। विश्व में मैंने बहुत सालों में ऐसी सिचुएशन नहीं देखी है कि इन्फ्लेशन ऊपर होने की वजह से जब ग्रोथ स्लो डाउन हो रहा है जियो पॉलिटिकल रीजन की वजह से या दूसरे कई कारणों से, उसके बाद भी सेंट्रल बैंक्स को इंटरेस्ट रेट्स बढ़ानी पड़ रही है। मगर हम इंडिया की बात करें, आई थिंक इंडिया इज इन अ फार बेटर सिचुएशन देन मोस्ट ऑफ द अदर कंट्रीज, वेदर वी कंपेयर आवरसेल्व्स विद इमर्जिंग मार्केट्स or we compare with the overall major economies of the world. India has been the fastest growing economy, major economy in the world. And I think for next several years, I think we will be able to retain that title. One of the fastest growing economy, major economy in the world. अगर आप देखें the positive implications of all the structural reforms that we have undertaken, whether you look at GST, you look at the IBC, you look at RERA, look at the digitalization that has happened, labor code, financial inclusion, privatization. After a very long time, we had a real privatization in the country. The social security net that we have spread over the last several years, I think will also keep us in good stead. I think that will have a good implication on structural growth in consumption also, as you provide a lot of social security to a large part of your population. Manufacturing, I think you touched upon it. While there are a lot of negatives, I think there are challenges on the external side, but I think there is a structural big opportunity in India because of the supply chains moving away, or if not moving away completely, but people are looking at China plus one. they are looking at alternatives, and I think India is presenting itself as one of the very good destination for manufacturing. So we have the, I mean, I always say this: we have the democracy, we have the demographics, we have demand, we have digitalization, and with all of these, I think India is very well positioned. Overall, balance sheets are in a very good shape. Over the last several years, I don't remember when is the last, I mean, at least in the last 5-7 years, I think this is the best possible shape one is looking at, whether it's a corporate balance sheet, the overall banking sector balance sheet, household balance sheet. Leverage has increased in last few years, but in India we started from a very low base, so there is nothing much to worry on that. And government also, I think credit to our government, despite the pressure from all sides during the COVID, the government had to increase the deficit, but I think we didn't go berserk the way a lot of other countries have gone. So I think the government kept the I mean, ran on a very tight. I mean, government did a very tight rope working on that. So overall, I think I'm relatively more positive on India. RBI was very supportive of growth earlier, but now looking at the evolving inflation dynamics, they had to increase interest rates. They had to tighten liquidity, so they've taken the repo rate from 4% to 490. Of course, short-term interest rates have increased much more because they've also tightened the liquidity. But overall, I think they have been saying that they would also be supportive of the growth, while immediately I think they will have to ensure that growth, I mean, the inflation expectations are well anchored, and they have to watch the global situation. We have to keep a close eye on how the geopolitical situation evolves, particularly because it has its implication on crude oil prices, where India is a large importer, and that impacts our external balance sheet, our overall fiscal balance sheet, consumer balance sheet. So we have to keep a close eye on that. So global commodity prices, inflation situation, we have to keep a close eye on that. But otherwise, by and large, I feel quite positive about India from a structural growth story perspective, and nothing has happened in last, I would say, few months. While markets may have corrected or growth may have slowed down a little bit, but most of the high frequency data that we look at, several of them are showing a positive sign. So I feel positive about the overall growth outlook in India.
राइट आई फील जो काफी सारे हेडलाइंस आ रहे हैं जो कह रहे हैं कि द इंडियन इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ स्टोरी हैज बीन डीरेल्ड आई फील वी कुड वर्ड इट बेटर एज परहैप्स मे बी डिफर्ड बट डेफिनेटली नॉट डीरेल्ड आई मीन डीरेल्ड इज क्वाइट स्ट्रॉन्गर टर्म राइट
So there have deferred be, matlab, credit growth is around 12-13%. This is higher than what we have seen in last few years. We look at the advanced tax collections, they've been good. If you look at the first 2 months of fiscal deficit data, this is one of the better ones than last couple of years. GST collections are at record high. I think there are at the margin improvement in the car sales, tractor sales. I think if you look at railway freight, we look at the power demand, uh, manufacturing PMI, in fact, service sector PMI. What else? I mean, look at the UPI volumes as well as the value. The import demand is increasing. Of course, the current account and trade deficit are going up, but higher imports, apart from the higher oil imports, but they also reflect like higher economic activity. LCVs and MCVs at the margin are showing some improvement. So I think there is, I mean, a lot of high frequency data are also showing that the growth is not like falling substantially or collapsing in India like some of the other parts of the world where they need to get more worried than in India.
Absolutely. In fact, जब आप पहले बता रहे थे, you briefly touched upon something really hot amongst investors, amongst analysts. It has become a topic of choice of debate, right? And that topic is inflation. Inflation has been heating up even as a metric, even as a topic, right? Quite literally. So, the recent print, May 22's inflation reported a sequential decline, marginal albeit, but well beyond the threshold. It's at almost 7.04%. इससे
Yeah,
पहले
yeah.
तकरीबन 7.8%, 7.798% type चल रहा था. So there has been slight softening. There are hopes of the inflationary heat also ebbing off कि आगे जाके जो गवर्नमेंट के पॉलिसीज इंप्लीमेंट हो रहे हैं, जो सेंट्रल बैंक के पॉलिसीज इंप्लीमेंट हो रहे हैं, उसका जो इफेक्ट है ट्रिकल डाउन हो जाएगा, एंड एटलीस्ट the core components of inflation जो है, जो कि food inflation है, वो जरा सा soft हो जाएगा even with better monsoons. जो काफी imported inflationary pressures है, which is majorly energy related, वो भी कहा जा रहा है ओपेक शायद इंटरवीन करेगा, सप्लाई बढ़ा देगा, तो थोड़ा बहुत जो है सप्लाई रिलेटेड डिसरप्शंस है ईज हो जाएगा. बट एट द सेम टाइम no one is taking off the hawkish stance on inflation off the table, right? We are still very far from the target range. और काफी जगहों पे ये भी कहा जा रहा है कि ये इन्फ्लेशन के चक्कर में कहीं ऐसा ना हो जाए कि ग्लोबल इकोनॉमी को स्लो डाउन की तरफ ढकेल दिया जाए, या फिर इन एक्सट्रीम सिचुएशंस रिसेशन की तरफ. इनफैक्ट आई वाज शॉक्ड एट द गूगल ट्रेंड्स ऑन द वर्ड रिसेशन. इट हैज स्पाइक्ड ड्रामेटिकली, almost as if everyone on the street is now almost worrying about a recession, right? So what is your view on how is inflation developing, and how will it impact, and the probability, just the sheer probability of a recession if it exists?
So पहली बात तो on inflation. So I think the May CPI was little over 7%, but WPI was higher, I think almost 15%, because a lot of commodity prices have gone up. Look at the entire energy basket, you look at all the industrial commodities like metals, I mean, look at agri commodities, almost all the commodity prices had gone up. But over the last few weeks, we have seen a lot of softening in all of these baskets. I think whether it's the energy prices, oil, gas, I think look at all the metals, you look at all the agri commodities, palm oil, everything has been showing signs of softening. So there is a possibility of like a positive surprise in the near term in the headline number compared to what the people have priced in or what the people have penciled in. Lot of, I think the government has also taken a lot of measures on the supply augmentation. There are tariff and non-tariff moves that they have taken. उससे कुछ फर्क पड़ेगा. Globally also, I think some of the supply disruptions जो थे, whether it was a shortage of chips or shipping capacities, etc., I think they are getting addressed, and structurally there is a possibility that we see some positive flow on that. Central banks are pulling back. I mean, on the liquidity side, even RBI, I mentioned that they've increased interest rates or they have taken liquidity back. So that will have some impact over a period of time. It works with a lag. But एक चीज ध्यान रखनी पड़ेगी that कुछ part जो inflation का वो शायद structural है. We have lived through a very, I would say, particular. I mean, talking about the global economy, we have lived through a very, a phase of very low inflation for a very, very long period of time. I think that era may have come to an end. And globally, I think this is the best thing that could happen. I think the higher inflation compared to where we were for a very, very long period of time. So the world needed inflation, whether it was the UK, US, the Europe or US or most of the other large economies have been trying very hard for a very, very long time to get some inflation. But they were not able to get that despite printing so much of money. Now that they are seeing inflation, which has definitely crossed their tolerance level or threshold, but maybe it will settle somewhere in between, because this higher inflation, these higher commodity prices will also lead to over a period of time supply side response, right? I mean, there would be more capex that will come in the private sector. The governments will also think of how do we ensure higher supplies are ensured over a long period of time. So there could be positive fallout of that higher inflation as well. And we had a long period where people were like over dependent on central banks printing so much of money as far as the markets were concerned. I think now it will be more driven by the economy and less driven by only the kind of the liquidity or the keeping the rates at a much lower end by the central banks. From an India's perspective, what we need to watch in the very near term is the monsoon that will have impact on agri commodities. Apart from the impact from the global prices, whether it's the sugar or corn or wheat or palm oil or most of the commodities, I think some bit of impact from the global prices, but also I think the impact of monsoon on the agri prices. If monsoon is good, then if agri prices behave well, we have seen some bit of moderation in most of the other industrial commodities and energy prices that I talked about. And there's a possibility that we see some positive news on that front, because I think markets have got excessively worried. But situation इतनी change हो जाती है नीरव, आपको याद होगा, मतलब at the beginning of 2020 Oil prices were high. We saw a level of like almost close to zero, in fact, on the futures market going below zero. And now you have an other extreme above 100. So these days, cycles are getting shorter and shorter on almost everything.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I feel cycles have compressed, and I feel equity cycles, the sentimental cycles of investors have compressed. The tolerance
Yeah,
levels of
yeah,
investors have compressed. Uh,
yeah.
you know, so in fact, when you spoke about inflation and the relationship of inflation with many developed counterparts in the world, the only phrase that came to my mind was "Be careful what you wish for." For it has been quite a long time that we've been wishing for inflation, but
Absolutely.
अब आ गया तो उसका क्या
That's
करना.
so well put. I mean, be careful what you wish for. I think all of these people. I mean, if you have read like ECB for last so many years,
Yeah.
struggling to get some inflation back. Same was with the U.S. Federal Reserve. Same thing was with BOE in England to get some inflation back, and now they have had trouble of inflation overshooting on the other side, and they haven't seen this in last 40, 50 years. The
Yes.
interesting thing, Nirav, I tell this to everyone, that in India we have a playbook. We understand inflation as a beast. I mean, what this animal is all about, because
Yeah.
we have seen several bouts of inflation, and because a large part of our CPI and WPI is also driven by the commodity prices, etc., where our policymakers understand that aspect, and whether it's the RBI or the government, they've always been very cognizant that this is a risk which you cannot ignore. Unlike the Western world or the developed markets, where for last 40 years there has been a structural decline in inflation, and suddenly they are seeing a 7 or 8%, and there is no playbook that they have how to deal with this.
it's it's almost as if destiny gifted them these many years worth of wishes together in one year कि एक साथ
Yeah,
आपकी सारी इच्छाएं पूरी कर देते हैं इन्फ्लेशन की. So I feel it's just a matter of time. It's almost time that they also learned about it. So when we are talking about the global markets, the developed markets, there is one another subject that I will absolutely have to talk about. And it is about the flows of money, especially from abroad, right? The foreign inflows that's happening. काफी कंसेक्यूटिव तकरीबन 9 महीनों से फॉरेन आउटफ्लो नेट फॉरेन आउटफ्लो हैज बीन द थीम, राइट. कंसिस्टेंटली आउटफ्लो ही हुए जा रहा है फॉरेन कैपिटल का. इनफैक्ट लास्ट मंथ जून, इफ आई एम नॉट रॉन्ग, द outflow from equities touched almost 50,000 odd crores,
yeah,
in INR terms. And I feel this is perhaps the most painful after जो 62 करोड़ हमने मार्च 2020 में at the onset of pandemic में देखा था. उसके बाद this is perhaps the steepest outflow that we have seen. One good saving grace is जहाँ पे 50,000 करोड़ का रिडेम्पशन हुआ, वहां पर डोमेस्टिक इन्वेस्टर्स ने ऑलमोस्ट 47,000 odd crores का बाइंग किया, and that is also very well reflected in how the markets have held up. In fact, domestic investors have been resilient for if my math serves me right, almost 16 months now, since the
yeah,
time they have been at least buying consistently in whatever volumes it be, right. So amid this entire global risk of जो कहा जा रहा है, risk of environment कहा
yeah,
जा रहा है
yeah,
कि that's hot money, वो जो तेजी से आ रहा है उससे दुगना तेजी से बाहर जा रहा है. And there is also a very strong notion कि the Indian markets depend really really heavily on these foreign inflows for its progress. Obviously, हालांकि आजकल हम देख रहे हैं कि domestic investors भी काफी strengthen हुए जा रहे हैं, but the
Hmm.
sustainability of such strength is still under a question. So ये entire
Hmm.
जो foreign inflows वाला part है, इस पे आपके क्या views है, क्या perception है ये situation पर?
You are right. I think in last 3 months, foreigners would have sold, I think, around 13, $14 billion. If you look at like calendar year, this year would be like around $28 billion or so. And they started selling, I think, from October onwards last year. And they would have sold more than $35 billion now. They're the highest ever, I mean, selling by the FPIs. And even if you see, I mean, you cannot look at only the absolute number, but even if you compare in terms of as percentage of market cap, is one of the highest, I think, in our history. But thanks to the resilience shown by the domestic investors, I think we have been able to absorb it. You'll remember a few years back, even few $1 billion of selling by the FPIs would have created such a large dent in the market sentiment, or would have created such a big drawdown in the market. I think that situation has undergone a change thanks to the resilience of the domestic investors. So kudos to regulators, kudos to people like you, kudos to the industry, which has worked very hard along with the media and everybody else to spread the word mutual fund sahi hai, the importance of long-term investing, the importance of disciplined investing, and that has resulted in the domestic industry becoming the this situation where we have been able to absorb these outflows. So our vulnerability to the global flows has come down very significantly, and this has huge repercussion not only from a market's perspective, but if there is large selling in the equity market, it has implications on money market, on currency, and even the wider economy sometimes. So from that perspective, I think this rise of domestic investors is a very, very important and a significant shift from the overall macro perspective in India. And I think, as you mentioned, the reason behind it, so there is a risk of sentiment. Globally, money may be moving from equity to debt, from emerging markets to developed markets, and maybe relatively valuations in some of the other emerging markets may have been cheaper, and they would have taken some chips off the table from India, because Indian markets would have delivered them better returns recently. So those are the reasons. But structurally, if you ask me, India remains one of the relatively more attractive investment destination from a longer term perspective. At some stage, when they find valuations turning attractive on a relative basis for them, maybe this money will start coming back. But I think as of now, we are in an environment where global rates are going up, global liquidity is shrinking, and money is moving from risk on to risk. I mean, the sentiments have turned from risk on to risk off. So FI outflows are there, but at some point in time, maybe we are likely to see a reversal of that as well.
Absolutely. In fact, as we talk about the resilience of domestic investors, there's another thing that comes to my mind basis my regular interactions with a lot many investors. I realize कि resilience तो काफी होता है इनमें, पर बीच बीच में एक दिल में जरा सी घबराहट सी होने लगती है, एक डर सा लगने लगता है कि मार्केट वोलेटाइल हो रहा है. और इसमें से काफी जो है दे आर दी पैंडेमिक बैच ऑफ इन्वेस्टर्स जिन्होंने 2020 2021 में उनका इन्वेस्टमेंट जर्नी शुरू किया था, and it is for the first time and for these, especially these batch of investors, that they're seeing such crazy amount of volatility and such amount of uncertainty. Obviously they're sticking to their guns, they're holding on to their portfolios, पर एक जो घबराहट quotient अगर कुछ होता है, if that exists, and that has been peaking at at crazy levels, and I've been sensing that. So I realize कि जब भी तेज हवा बहती है, तभी जब जैसे खेत में देखा जाता है कि जो विनोइंग होता है, जिससे गेहूं और घुन को अलग किया जाता है, the husk is separated from the grain only when such wind blows. I feel now is such a time when the real great investors will be separated from the ordinary investors. बट आपके हिसाब से ऐसे वोलेटाइल टाइम्स में, आपने तो बहुत सारे साइकिल्स देखे हैं, इन्वेस्टर्स देखे, सीजन्स देखे, आपके अकॉर्डिंग ऐसे कौन से गलतियां है जो इन्वेस्टर्स कर लेते हैं जिसके वजह से वो ऑर्डिनरी टू ग्रेट का जो फासला है वो तय नहीं कर पाते, वो सफर पूरा नहीं कर पाते, वो ऑर्डिनरी पर रह जाता है? व्हाट आर दोज मिस्टेक्स दैट होल्ड देम बैक अक्रॉस, स्पेशली अक्रॉस सच वोलेटाइल टाइम्स?
सो जैसा आपने सही उदाहरण दिया, लाइक लास्ट 1 या 2 साल में कई बार ऐसी वॉलेटिलिटी इन्वेस्टर्स ने देखी होगी. अगर आपको याद हो, फरवरी 2020 में निफ्टी ने नया हाई टच किया था 12,000 का, एंड विद इन फ्यू वीक्स जब कोविड का स्प्रेड चालू हुआ और डर लगने लगा, और जब लॉकडाउन्स वगैरह हुए, तो शायद नीचे में हमने 7700-7800 का लेवल देखा. तो काफ़ी इन्वेस्टर्स उस समय पर डर गए कि मार्केट इतना गिर गया, अभी आगे वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमी, आपने स्टार्ट ही वहीं से किया था कॉन्वर्सेशन, अभी इकोनॉमी क्या लगती है, अभी मार्केट क्या लगता है, तो उस समय थोड़ा सा घबराहट का माहौल था. अब जिसने उस घबराहट में बेच दिया, उनका तो लॉस बुक हो गया. 12,000 से मार्केट 8,000 पे गिरा और आपका लॉस बुक हो गया. अगले कुछ महीनों तक म्यूचुअल फंड इंडस्ट्री में रिडम्पशंस रहा. मार्च में तो काफ़ी अच्छा पॉजिटिव रहा, बट अगले कुछ महीने रिडम्पशंस आया. बट जिन्होंने रिडीम नहीं करा और जो लोग निवेशक बाजार में रह गए, तो मेरे ख्याल में अक्टूबर के आसपास वापस निफ्टी 12,000
Yes.
के लेवल पे आ गया,
Yes.
राइट। कोविड तो उसके बाद 1 साल तक चला, अभी भी हम
Yes.
कोविड केसेस सुनते हैं, राइट।
Yes.
बट मार्केट अल्टीमेटली पूरा रिकवर हो गया। मेरे को याद है हमारा जो फ्लेक्सी कैप फंड है उसकी एनएवी करीब 660-70 के आसपास थी उस समय, वो नीचे में शायद 400 रुपए के आसपास आ गई एनएवी गिर के, जब बाजार गिरा इतना। तो और जिसने होल्ड किया है तो अभी 1-2 साल के बाद वो करीब 1,000 रुपए के आसपास है, 980
Yes.
990 कुछ के ऊपर में, 1100 के ऊपर भी गई थी। तो अगर आपने एवरेज करते रहे आप इस टाइम पर, और अगर टॉपअप
Yes.
कर लिया अपनी एसआईपी को, तो आपने तो अपना पैसा बहुत अच्छा बना लिया, मतलब ऑलमोस्ट डबल हो गया वो नीचे के लेवल से। और अगर पहले का भी पैसा पड़ा था और अगर आपने विड्रॉ नहीं करा तो आपके अच्छे रिटर्न्स बन गए। वो डिसिप्लिन रख पाना बहुत जरूरी है, तभी वो जो आप एक ग्रेट इन्वेस्टर बन सकते हो। वो डिसिप्लिन रखना, वो संतुलन रखना, वो अपना नियमितता रखना उस एसआईपी में, और बाजार पर अपना लॉन्ग टर्म का ध्यान रखना, और शॉर्ट टर्म जो न्यूज फ्लो रहती है उससे स्वेड नहीं होना, मतलब यू शुड नॉट गेट स्वेड बाय द वॉलेटिलिटी, यू हैव टू टेक एडवांटेज ऑफ द वॉलेटिलिटी। सो आई थिंक वो बहुत जरूरी है।
I feel you made a very very important point around discipline. I feel चाहे आपका जो भी काम हो, जो भी profession हो, it's not just investing. I feel whatever you do in life, discipline is perhaps the key differentiator that separates the ordinary from the great. And investing success is no different from any other form of success, right?
एब्सोल्युटली।
Especially when it comes to what's required. इनफैक्ट जब हम इसकी बात कर रहे हैं तभी साथ ही साथ एक कंसेप्ट हैज कम टू द फोर, दैट इज द आइडिया ऑफ रिस्क, राइट? जो रिस्क का परसेप्शन होता है वो काफी अलग होता है। आपने कहा था कि जो इन 12,000 के लेवल्स पे जिन्होंने इन्वेस्ट किया 8,000 हो गए, डर गए। एंड आई रियलाइज काफी हमारे पास भी काफी क्वेरीज आई थी। एंड देन व्हेन वी रीविजिटेड, हमने ये समझा कि काफी ऐसे लोग थे जिन्होंने एट द आउटसेट कहा कि भैया हमारा रिस्क प्रोफाइल तो बहुत ही एग्रेसिव है, हमें कोई चिंता नहीं, चाहे जितना वोलेटिलिटी आ जाए। And they had this perception of the risk till it actually manifested, right? So it is also very important for one to understand their own risk appetite, and then उसके बेसिस पे एक बार आप डिसिप्लिन पे सेट आउट कर जाते हो तो उस पे स्टिक रहिएगा। सो ये जो रिस्क,
बिल्कुल।
ये जो रिस्क का परसेप्शन है और जो इन्वेस्टिंग डिसिप्लिन है, इसके बीच में एक बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट सा कंसेप्ट होता है एसेट एलोकेशन, कि आपका खुद का रिस्क प्रोफाइल और इन्वेस्टमेंट ऑब्जेक्टिव को समझते हुए एक एसेट एलोकेशन तैयार करना चाहिए, और उसके बाद यू स्टिक विद इट थ्रू आउट विद utmost discipline. But I have understood that many investors face this problem. What is the best way to decide the ideal asset allocation? मतलब कोई टेक्स्ट बुक फॉर्मूला तो है नहीं आइडियल एसेट एलोकेशन का। काफी लोगों ने थंब रूल्स यूज करने की कोशिश की है, 100 माइनस एज, फिर वो ट्रांसफॉर्म होकर 110 माइनस एज शुड बी योर इक्विटी एक्सपोजर। इसमें से
ओ,
कुछ भी काम नहीं कर पा रहे। तो आपके हिसाब से मान लीजिए अगर कोई ले पर्सन है और कोई डीआईवाई इन्वेस्टर है जो कि जिसके पास एक्सेस नहीं है कोई एडवाइजर का या कोई प्रोफेशनल का, हाउ कैन ही एटलीस्ट स्टार्ट अप्रोचिंग एसेट एलोकेशन एज अ कंसेप्ट?
नहीं, आपने बोला जैसे थंब रूल लोग लेते हैं, 100 माइनस एज या 110 माइनस एज या 90, आप 10-20 टका इधर उधर कर लीजिए। ये कई चीज़ों पर निर्भर करता है। सबसे पहले अपना गोल बनाना चाहिए, आप किस गोल के लिए निवेश कर रहे हैं, और उसके हिसाब से फिर अगर आप एक अपना इन्वेस्टमेंट पॉलिसी बनाते हैं जहाँ हम देखें आपकी रिटर्न एक्सपेक्टेशंस क्या है, मतलब सबसे पहले तो आपकी सेविंग्स क्या है और गोल क्या है, आप कितना निवेश कर सकते हैं और आपको आपको किस गोल के लिए निवेश करना है। तो उसके बेसिस पे जब आप प्लान बनाते हैं तो आप अपना रिटर्न एक्सपेक्टेशन देखते हैं, अपना रिस्क एपेटाइट देखते हैं। रिस्क एपेटाइट की बात करें तो हाउ मच ड्रॉ डाउन यू कैन टेक। Equity markets can fall 20 or 30% also in 1 year. I mean, in 2008, we saw a much bigger drawdown in one single year, or within a span of few months between September and the March next year. But even otherwise, I mean, at any point in time, you may have a 10 or 20% correction in the market. So whether you have the risk appetite to handle when your statement is showing that kind of number, though you know that in the long run, this is the asset class which would deliver better returns, this is the asset class which would deliver inflation beating returns, but in between you may have those periods। और आजकल तो बिकॉज ऐप पे आपको एनएवी दिख रही है, ऐप पे आपको रिटर्न दिख रहा है रोज, तो वो साइकोलॉजिकली हाउ टू प्रिपेयर फॉर इट इज ऑल्सो वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। फिर आपका टैक्स स्टेटस क्या है, आपकी लिक्विडिटी नीड्स क्या है, कोई बीच में ऐसी तो समय नहीं है जब आपको शायद वो पैसों की जरूरत पड़े, तो वो फिर एक इमरजेंसी फंड के लिए अलग अलग निकाल लीजिए। तो आई थिंक एक फाइनेंशियल एडवाइजर रखेंगे तो ज़्यादा अच्छा रहेगा, जो आपको एक होलिस्टिक पिक्चर दे सके। अगर हम डॉक्टर के पास भी जाते हैं और अगर एक पर्टिकुलर कोई फीवर है और उसी की दवाई ले, उसके बजाय अगर आपको कोई पूरा बॉडी को एक होलिस्टिक तरीके से देखे और उसके बाद हम सजेस्ट करें मेडिसिन तो ज्यादा बेटर रहेगा।
Absolutely. So, जैसे कि guys, it is always better to visit a doctor and then get prescribed medicines. It मैं मानता हूँ इंडिया में ये काफी चलता है कि डायरेक्टली फार्मेसी वाले भैया के पास चले जाते हैं कि थोड़ा सर्दी खांसी हुआ है, तो सर्दी जुकाम है उसकी दवाई दे दो, बट ओवर द काउंटर मेडिकेशंस कैन ओनली डू सो मच। जरूरी है कि आप एक होलिस्टिक व्यू से अपने हेल्थ की और वेल्थ की दोनों की जांच कराइए, राइट? सो फॉर योर ओन वेल्थ ऑल्सो रीच आउट टू अ ग्रेट एडवाइजर, right? Or seek professional help. The team here, the research team at Fisdom is more than glad. We are reachable at research@fisdom.com. Just write to us if you have any questions, just broadly. We will try to address it, while not really trying to give you a definitive, but we will still try to help you in the best way possible that we can. It's Navneet, जब हम इतने investors की बात कर रहे हैं और इतने behavioral aspects की बात कर रहे हैं, I realized one thing and I'm really intrigued. Even I want to hear about this. It is कि ठीक है, हमने तो बाकी सारे इन्वेस्टर्स की बात कर ली, राइट फ्रॉम फॉरेन पोर्टफोलियो इन्वेस्टर्स टू डोमेस्टिक रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स, बट आपकी क्या कहानी है? व्हाट इज योर स्टोरी? हाउ डिड द first time happen when you first invested your first rupee into capital markets or any associated product? How did you get introduced to the world of capital markets?
So I think it was just the luck that maybe I think I invested in an IPO when I was 11, but that was like way back, more than 40 years
when
back now.
when you were
When I
11?
was 11, yeah, yeah. So there was some IPO and then I invested. But I mean, it wasn't a disciplined investing throughout the I would say school life or the college life or even later. Understanding the power of compounding is the most important thing and getting that discipline. So it took like several years to reach there after coming to the more professional money management. But yeah, it was interesting journey. I saw the bull market of 1985, saw the bull market of 1992, saw of course the 2000, and each one of them were unique in their own ways, but there are a lot of similarities as well. I think the basic tenets of investing don't change. The basic tenets of how people behave or the how the markets behave, I think they don't change over a long period of time. History keeps repeating, and then we saw in 2008 and of course some time back. So I think that those are like very very important learning. But as I said, I think the most important lesson, and if somebody is lucky, and in today's world, because of the availability of so much of information and research online, so much of the awareness that has got created thanks to the industry's effort and everybody else's effort, if somebody starts understanding that at a very very early age, that it's all about power of compounding, it's all about keeping that discipline over a very long period of time. So I mean, in your initial years, as long as you are saving something, your spending is less than your income, and you start investing that, and it's not only about the savings, I think you invested right. And then in the first several years, I think the graph will move like in a very very steady manner. But then you see that the compounding actually is seen a few decades later. I mean, everybody knows about the Buffett story that when he turned 50, it was a billion, but today it's like multiples of that in the last 30 or 40 years. So, but he would have started investing so early, but still for him to reach $1 billion took a couple of decades, but then billion to become 100 billion didn't take as much longer. So I think that's very, very important to understand.
Absolutely. The first, they always say, right, the first million is the toughest. And once you get
Absolutely.
that, then there's momentum. And
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the audience, yeah, for the audience, guys, अगर आप compound interest का formula देखे, एक ही वेक्टर है जो exponentiality lend करता है, और वो है time. और
absolutely.
वो आप आपका इन्वेस्टमेंट अमाउंट, नवनीत, लग रही है आप एट एनी गिवन पॉइंट इन टाइम आपका इन्वेस्टमेंट अमाउंट बढ़ा सकते हैं, आपका इंस्ट्रूमेंट चेंज कर सकते हैं, पर खोया हुआ टाइम आप वापस नहीं ला पाओगे,
बिल्कुल
राइट?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल.
And that is a very very important variable in the entire concept of wealth creation. ये आप सभी ऑडियंस के लिए होमवर्क है, सर्च कीजिएगा, योर कीवर्ड्स आर एक्सपोनेंशियलिटी, उससे भी आसान कंपाउंडिंग, जस्ट सर्च पावर ऑफ कंपाउंडिंग. there is enough and more literature available on it, and I feel it may sound simple, but Navneet has given you perhaps the the pinnacle of secret sauce when it comes to wealth creation. And Navneet, I also realized that आप capital market से तभी रूबरू हो गए थे इस उम्र पे जब काफी कईयों को कैपिटल मार्केट सही से स्पेल करना भी नहीं आता था. When you said you invested at the age of 11, I feel as luck would have had it, I'm just surprised to hear that you were so fortunate enough to interact with the gold mine that capital markets is at a very early age. And more importantly, when you said that over years and years of experience, perhaps the biggest takeaway that you got is that discipline and the power of compounding are two factors that can transform fortunes to a great extent. So I absolutely loved your story on that, Navneet. इनफैक्ट कई सारे क्वेश्चंस आए हुए हैं, बहुत सारे. इनफैक्ट आई एम नॉट श्योर कि इतने सारे मैं ले पाऊंगा या नहीं, बट आई विल स्टिल ट्राई एंड पिक अ कपल ऑफ देम इन इंटरेस्ट ऑफ टाइम, एंड आई आल्सो वांट टू पिक दिस. सो नवनीत, वन क्वेश्चन काफी सिंपल से तरीके में लिखा गया बट बहुत ही कॉम्प्लेक्स क्वेश्चन है. हाउ मेनी फंड्स आर टू मेनी फंड्स इन अ पोर्टफोलियो?
I think again, as I said, that depends on each individual investor, and each investor would be different, and you cannot generalize it. But it's like the good wealth is created by I would say a sensible or a moderate diversification. Too much of diversification is not good, and then too much of concentration is not good. I think it should be somewhere in the middle, and it will depend on like each individual. आपने एक बार asset class decide कर दी, वो सबसे बड़ा decision है. उसके बाद I think select just few good funds, and that should be fine.
Okay, that's pretty appropriate. I feel the next question is again on a very macroeconomic development. The question is around the Russia-Ukraine war. The question says that people are not yet talking about the ramifications, long-term ramifications of the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you think that there will be an overhang of this war even on the Indian economy for longer than one can think?
So, just to give you a parallel of the COVID, right? So when COVID hit and there was not even a single case, or maybe there would have been like 10, 20 cases here and there, Nifty fell from 12,000 to 8,000. And then when the numbers increased to 500 and 5,000 and 50,000 and even 5 lakhs, by that time the market had actually started increasing, right? And market had almost recovered in the next 6 or 7 months all the losses that market had in the month of March, because from an unknown risk that became a known unknown risk. And over a period of time, this year maybe pandemic, maybe somewhere is still there, but it is a known risk. Market is not even paying attention to it. So the risk that impact is, there are three kinds of risk. I think one of the US Defense Secretary put it very nicely. You have unknown, known unknown, and unknown. So around last year, I used to say, just to create an acronym so that I remember it, what are the risks for 2022 that investors should be watching? So it is pandemic, prices, which is basically inflation, policy, which is like how central banks and the other fiscal policy reacts to it, and fourth is politics, which is like the geopolitics. And in these four, the pandemic has become more like a known. It won't have much impact. Prices and policy reaction are like known unknown. You know about it, but let's say inflation, whether it can, instead of 4% can be 8%, then of course the implications would be different. But the real unknown at that point in time was like geopolitics, like how it'll take a shape, because there was no way to predict that this event would happen in February, or it may not have happened for next 12 months also, the event that happened in the February, which the investor is asking about. Now, I think isn't that a known unknown? It's not an unknown which would have a large repercussion on the market. So we don't know what the next unknown could be. At any point in time, there would be some bit of uncertainty, and that's why you make higher returns in equity, right? In the equity market, returns don't come in a linear fashion. All of us can talk about the Sensex was 100 in 1979. It's like 54, 55,000 today. It's gone up 550 times. But there would have been several times when it fell 10%, 20%, 30%, even in 2008. it fell like 60% from the peak in January to the bottom in I think sometime in October. So that volatility will always be there, depending on let's say some of these kind of events. But there are two ways to look at it. Would you like try to pay too much of attention to it, and again then you will get swayed by the volatility, or you take a longer view. And how to take that longer view? I give you another way to look at it. So let's say from 91, 92 for next 25 years or so. Of course, during the COVID period, it underwent a change, but there was like almost a 25-year period where India's economy would have grown by, let's say, around 12, 13%. Nominal GDP would have grown at 12, 13%. Corporate profits grew at like 13, 14%. Market capitalization increased by like almost 14, 15% in that period. But and market delivered that return, right? What was the growth in the corporate profit? Slightly better than that, because the valuations would have got I mean, there would have been an increase in the P ratio. But the main important aspect is that during this period, there were like a lot of
Yeah.
cycles. So one way is to look at that longer term aspect, that ultimately what is the stock price? It is a slave of the earning power of
Earning.
the underlying companies, right? It's a slave of the earning powers. If corporate earnings are increasing over a period of time, that will get reflected in the stock price. But in the near term, sentiments, liquidity, foreign flows, domestic flows, the news flow, all of that will impact the market. But I think main important thing is to pay attention to that. What moves prices? Three things, right? Earnings growth, dividend yield, and change in PE. So earnings growth over the next several years, if we have confidence that India's economy, nominal GDP can grow at 12, 13%. Dividend yield in India is not very high, so let's say around 1.5% or so. The change in P, I mean, if you are investing in a market where the valuations are excessively high, your returns would be lower than the earnings growth over the next several years. If you are entering where the valuations are excessively cheap, and there is a if the P ratio goes up, you get that additional return over and above the earnings growth. That's how one has to kind of look at it. As we speak now, I think the valuations are not, I would say, excessively richly valued or not excessively cheap. I think we are somewhere in the middle, slightly higher than the longer term average still. But if you look at, let's say, 2024, I think as of now, Nifty PE would be around what 16 times or so. In few months time, people would start looking at FY24, so 16 should be like kind of fine, unless earnings expectations undergo a change. That's a different thing. But I think from that perspective, over the next several years, return should be in line with the growth of the economy. That's what one needs to keep in mind.
Absolutely, Navneet. I absolutely love the three important factors you spoke about. The earnings growth, the changes in PE, and the dividend yield. I feel these are very, very important factors. And I loved the known unknown framework. Just put everything so much into perspective. Every other factor that you spoke about as you were speaking, I was just classifying each one of them into the known unknown framework that you spoke about. I feel that's a great framework to put things into perspective. So, Navneet, one last question as we move towards the end of this conversation. Again, it is, it is a slightly funny question, but question nonetheless. The question is: everyone says to invest for the long term. How long is long term exactly?
So as like, I mean, somebody asked, if I remember correctly, I don't know, Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, that I mean, when is a good time to sell? He said never. I mean, if you have a good stock, why to sell unless you need money? So long term meaning, like, depending on what's the age of the investor who's asking this question. I don't know if he has mentioned or she has mentioned that. I mean, if you are a young person investing, and you have certain financial goals over a period of time, you want to have your home, or if you have family and are investing for your children's education, or if it is for the retirement, then I think it has to be a much longer period. If you have a certain goal, like in next 2 or 3 years, I think you have certain commitments and putting the money, then that should rather go into the fixed income and not into the equity. But if it is to meet longer term goals and you have the risk appetite, you can stomach the volatility that equity market can exhibit in the short run, then I think, yeah, long term is much longer than what people think. I think the one of the biggest risk, you talked about risk, Nirav, and that's very important. The risk that is underestimated by most of the people is actually longevity. that the average life expectancy of somebody born in India on 1947 would have been somewhere in like mid 30s. Today that number is like above 70. It has like almost doubled in let's say 1 or 2 generations. And the pace at which the medical the science is progressing, in next few years this number is only going to be higher. And I mean, let's say if you retire in your 50s or let's say 60s, you have another 30, 40 years to kind of live on those savings. And it's a very, very important aspect to keep in mind. And still, when we think about long term, people think about 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. People are not thinking in terms of decades that you'll need those savings to help you meet your retirement needs. And there, another thing that one has to add is the lifestyle inflation. So in
Yes.
all the calculators that you would have on your Fisdom app or any other app or on our HDFC mutual fund app that we would have, we'll put like what is the inflation? You put like whatever the current number. I mean, maybe a few quarters back you would have put 4%. Today maybe you put 6, 7. But what about the lifestyle inflation? Your lifestyle is changing continuously. You were
Yes.
taking different vacation than what you are taking today. You didn't have some of these, the
Yes.
electronic devices that you have today, relatively, or variety of other expenditures that you are incurring today wasn't the case few years back. So lifestyle is also changing. So when you're looking at your future goals, you have to keep that also in mind, and that's why it's important people pay attention that our incomes are going to be higher over a period of time, our lifestyle inflation would be higher, and we are going to live longer. And for that, you need a lot of savings in place.
So for this question, I think I can give the person whoever is asking this question, maybe the short and sweet answer for you is how long is long term? Forever, if you can.
Yeah.
I feel for
When I
as
mean you
long.
have a reason to take that money out and spend. I
Yeah.
mean, when if you have saved for retirement, once you retire and you don't have your the salary or whatever income that you had at that point in time, you need that money back. So I have a systematic withdrawal plan from that point in time. Or if you have saved money for your children's education, get the best education possible as and when the child turns 18, 19, 20, 22, whenever they need the education. So that's the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, this reminded me of one of the phrases one of my friends used to say. The two biggest risks in life at this point, financial risks, are die early or live long. And the second one is far more dangerous than the first one. In the first
Yeah.
one, you need to just ensure everyone's protected. But in the second one,
Yeah.
the very thought of it is pretty unnerving, right? Now, when you put it
Yeah.
into perspective, people would just realize that what we are earning for approximately our career would be in a proper settled phase for what 30 odd years, and we got to live off of that earnings for the next 40 years if we were to retire at whatever 50, 60. I feel
Yeah.
a very important thing that you spoke about, that is retirement planning. I feel I'll park that for another day, but this is a subject in itself that I recognize is a gap in India especially, so I will reserve that for a conversation on some other day. But today, in interest of time, Navneet, we will bring this conversation to a close. In fact, I just can't keep getting enough of your insights. Okay, I'm just so much into this conversation, but I'm very hopeful that we once again get a chance to interact on a variety of other topics as well. And Navneet, thanks a lot for your insights. I feel it. I need not really say it, but it was superbly insightful and really fun. Just engaging and listening to how you view things. I feel you put a lot many things into perspective rather simply, and has I really hope that many people have a lot to take away, as much as at least I have to take away from this conversation.
Thank you. Entirely my pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Navneet. Been a pleasure.
Thank you.